Hi all, let's have a look at the FIDE World Chess Championship match 2024. This is round 2, so this is the 26th of November 2024. Ding Liren with the white pieces against Gukesh. So e4 from Ding Liren, we have e5. We go into the Italian game, which has risen in popularity in recent years as a viable alternative, even at Super Grandmaster level, to the Ruy Lopez or Spanish game. So the Italian game is pretty popular, and in fact I've recently created a course which you can see at Udemy on my Kingscrusher TV page if you want to check out the Italian game, be able to play it with great confidence with the white pieces. So here we see the gioco piano, bishop c5. If black had played knight f6, this is the two knights defense. The structure of the Italian game is really it's a lot more straightforward than the Ruy Lopez. There's a lot less variations to have to know about. And in fact, if knight f6 had been played, I would bet d3 would be Ding Liren's choice, because he's up in the match now after winning game 1. This would be a solid choice. At the amateur level, knight g5 is usually the move chosen. It's aggressive, but there are so many different lines that happen, and there's a dangerous idea that black has here with knight a5. This gambit can offer black great compensation. So the stable move, which I would have predicted if knight f6, is just the move d3. This is all the rage now at the Super Grandmaster level. So say bishop c5, c3, and white has a small edge without too much risk. This is the sort of position I believe we would have had if knight f6. But bishop c5, we have d3. Now, in the Romantic era of chess, b4, the Evans gambit, would have been used by the likes of Paul Morphy and Adolf Anderson and other attacking players. It leads to a very exciting play after taking, and then the bishop moves somewhere, a5 or e7. And, white builds up a strong centre. That's a very interesting, entertaining possibility, which I've covered in my Italian game course, the Evans gambit. It's really great to revise games of Paul Morphy, especially. He was a big Evans gambit exponent. So anyway, we are in 2024. The Evans gambit is not so popular nowadays. d3 is played. We have knight f6, and now here we enter what Exeter Chess Club has called an old stodge, and recommends junior players avoid this move, knight c3, because it doesn't lead to many open lines. It is a solid alternative to the move c3, which is usually played. It is actually named the Italian game four knights variation. It is the four knights variation. As a flavour of c3, a6, and white could dare castle, and we could dare play soon bishop g5. It doesn't really matter about h6 and g5. This isn't a particularly bad position for white. This is okay. This is about even. Black can play this way. It's actually about even, technically. So, okay, anyway. Knight c3 is played. We have a6, a4, and there does seem to be an intriguing plan that white plays. So after castling, black doesn't yet commit to castling. Black plays h6. That prevents that bishop g5 nuisance pin. We have bishop e3, not minding if black wants to double the pawns. Black plays bishop e6. Now, in case you have caveman tendencies like I often have on faster time controls especially, g5, you might ask, why not g5? Because isn't there this general principle that white needs to be aware not to castle too quickly, because black could just fling the pawns down? It's not advisable here. It's quite interesting to see the refutation. It's bishop takes c5, d takes, and now what do you think white should play here? Bishop d5, which indirectly adds more pressure to e5. We're threatening bishop takes c6, and it makes this look like a load of weaknesses have just been created for nothing, and black's absolutely losing. If queen e7, again, this is a wreck for black, and it's absolutely a big advantage. If knight takes d5 here, knight b4, again, this is a very unpleasant position for black with loads and loads of weaknesses to be able to make use of. So this is completely inadvisable for black to play g5. If bishop takes e3, this is not such a terrible move. For both sides, there's trade-offs. White's double pawns here control. Central double pawns are not so bad controlling key squares. So it doesn't really matter about the double pawns in this case. And for example, this position, knight d2, we have an even position here. b3 is also possible. And here, this position is also even. We've got also enjoyment potentially of this semi-open f-file later. In faster time controls, that could be dangerous sometimes with tactics potentially on that semi-open f-file. So anyway, black just played bishop e6, volunteering also double pawns. And both sides are just ignoring that option. I mean, for black, it would also just give this control over key squares like white would have had. And that semi-open f-file, it would be okay. So anyway, a5 though is played, which does create some very interesting variations which may have been prepared. You see, isn't this a potential liability pawn to things like bishop b4? This is an intriguing question I had. The thing is, this is a fine enough move. If knight d5 instead, we could have some simplification and more simplification. And here, knight d4 hits the queen. And knight takes e6 is actually possible. This is a possible way a game could have gone, potentially. And it just leads to an even position, actually. It's just an even position. So knight d5 doesn't seem to be that ambitious. a5 kind of sets, I would say, a little trap, actually. Bishop takes c4 is bypassing, is interesting. Let's just go with bishop takes c4 for a moment. If black castles, then we can play actually knight d5, and this just leads to an even position here. This is just an even position. Although we weakened f4 now, it's not a big deal. This is just an even position. So bishop takes c4. We have d takes c4. And now here is some interest behind the scenes of this game. There was a question raised when I was looking at this live bishop b4, and it's not immediately obvious why this would be a bad idea, because that does seem to be a disconnected kind of pawn in white's camp. What do you think white should play here and why for 100 points? It's quite fascinating, I would say. Well, especially for chess nerds, it's quite fascinating for me. Knight d5, how this is actually a very powerful move here. So this is all behind the scenes. If bishop takes a5, knight h4, believe it or not, and white has a clear advantage here. If knight takes e takes, queen takes h4, d takes c6, so we're hitting that bishop. If b6, queen d5, bishop b4, and actually that bishop after bishop c1 is trappable with b4. So this is just a way of trapping the bishop. This whole line is interestingly an advantage, whatever happens here it seems. If knight e7, rook takes a5, that's just winning a piece. If knight b8 to keep the queen protecting, hitting h4, we can just play queen g4 here. And let's say g5, knight f5. We get a huge compensation here with that knight on f5. This is absolutely massive, this position for white. Big advantage. So yes, it's quite fascinating how bishop b4, knight d5, these are fascinating lines. If black castles c3, the damage has been done here. We have knight h4 in this position, and if knight takes e4, knight f5, with very dangerous ideas like queen g4, looking at g7 as well as the knight. So g6, queen g4, queen takes e4. This is a huge position for white, where queen h5, queen h6, we've got actually a winning attack. So this may have been part of preparation about this a5 move. It's a fascinating aspect, this bishop b4, how this is giving advantage to white. So yes, if castles c3, if bishop c5, bishop takes c5, this position is a very comfortable position for white indeed. A lot of pressure with advantage. So yes, it does seem bishop b4, knight d5 is the key recipe, which may have been prepared. Knight h4 here is really quite amazing. So yes, knight takes queen g4. If knight g5, f4, knight e6, we get f5 in here, f6. This is also a very strong attacking position. This is really amusing stuff behind the scenes of this game. Check, h4, and then here we have a very strong attack position, very big advantage. Let's look at this again with e takes f4. We would have knight f5. If f takes e3, knight takes g7 check, and knight e6 check is crushing. Knight takes, what would you play here for 10 points? Yeah, black's pieces are on the queen side here largely. We can play rook takes f7 check, and we have a superiority of attack on this side of the board. We're crashing through. We're absolutely winning here. Yeah, this is a devastating position. If knight e7, yeah, it's absolutely a devastating position. Okay, so things like rook f7. If knight e7, so yeah, if that's the best, that's not good. So anyway, this is all behind the scenes. Bishop b4. So anyway, in the game, black castled. We have bishop takes c5, d takes b3, queens come off, boos from the crowd. Oh, queens come off, how dull. Okay, Mikhail Tal wouldn't have allowed the queens to come off so easily, surely. So we have rook d to c1. What's going on here? So the thing is, if knight e1, we could play this with the idea of knight d3 to attack what seems to be one of the more vulnerable pawns in black's position. It is kind of disconnected from the other pawns, and also looking at e5 as well. We could play this, and this does seem like a critical alternative, knight e1 to rook d to c1. Does seem like a critical alternative. Let's take the case of rook takes d1, rook takes. We can actually let a5 go, because knight d3 here is double attacking these two guys. And we end up actually with a position here, knight d5, looking at c7, we end up getting a pawn back here. If not, c6, we end up with a small edge here, knight e7 check, knight b2. This is actually a small edge for white. This scenario, we have some compensation here, okay, to work with, which actually gives us a small edge. This is an interesting alternative. Well, interesting is a relative term in chess. Given the position, it's a relatively interesting move, knight e1. So let's just recap here. Rook takes d1. We've got this knight d3 here. If b6, knight takes e5, we're going to get a small edge here, actually. So this position, we end up, after g4 check, knight takes e4, we do actually end up with a small edge in the rook and pawn ending, but nothing more. And if, yeah, rook takes d1 is good. King h8 as example is a bad idea. If knight d3 is allowed to happen here, then that a pawn is ready for, you know, a takes and rook takes a6. So this is bad news for black. If h5 here, knight d3, this position, knight takes, this can lead to an even position. We end up having basically a lot of simplification, and it ends up being about even here. If rook d4, f3, and this situation, knight b4, knight takes b6, it ends up being, maybe you could argue it is a small edge here. It is a small edge here in this position for white, but nothing more. So anyway, rook d to c1 was played. We have knight d4. Now white really doesn't want to take on d4 because it moves that pawn out of harm's way. Potentially c takes, and then e4 drops, unless we play knight d5. But yeah, if knight a4, yeah, there's nothing, you know, to hit anymore. Yeah, this is not advisable. It would just be giving black a decent game. So we have knight e1. So the issue is here that knight d3 is not possible with the rook on the d file. We have king f1. If knight d3, yeah, that is a potentially unprotected piece. Knight takes b3 as one example, forking the rooks. rook takes d3 gives black actually a significant advantage here. Rook d4 and rook d8, significant advantage. And also the job would be done with knight takes c2 to undermine d3 as well. Significant advantage for black. So that's a big no-no in this particular position to play knight d3. So king f1 is played. We have g6, rook d1 here. Now, some kibitzers have mentioned, for example, at chessgames.com, which is a great site, rook cb1 as a plan for b4. It's not that potentially lethal if black plays their cards right here. h5, and let's go with f3, because if we play knight d5, there's knight takes e4 here. That's good for black. And let's just go with f3. h4 is one of the better moves, sometimes threatening h3. Knight d5. And here knight takes, c takes. Black has f5, and the idea would be c3. That's one of the key ideas of this rook b1. And here it's just even, actually. It's not such a big deal. If black reacts like this, black should have enough for equality at least. And yeah, if we look at this again, if we had played b4 here, c takes, black does have enough after b6, a takes, a5, believe it or not. Black does have this resource a5. If we take on a5, our rooks get forked, and this should just lead to an even position, actually, overall. If rook goes back there, then black's fine. It's even. So anyway, yeah, it does seem with careful, accurate play that this rook b1 plan, c to b1 plan, move 17, rook c1, it shouldn't be dangerous. If one of another king g7 knight d5, this situation is also a situation which, let's take this situation, e takes knight d3. White does have a small edge here though in this situation, and knight d7 even more pronounced edge with this idea here. Knight takes c7 is a tactic here, exploiting the loose pieces in the center, and white would get a definite advantage there. So yeah, if black's careful though, black should be fine. So h5, f3, h4 is one of the better moves here. Okay, so anyway, in the game, rook d1 is played, and we have rook fd8. If knight fd7, with the idea of playing for f5, which seems kind of logical because the rook's x-raying the king, we can play knight d5 here, and we're looking at c7. If c6, just going back actually, and the point is on f5 we take on f5 and then play knight a4. This position, it leads actually to an advantage for white. This is black's kind of overcommitted the pawns, and we can actually play a move like f4 here, and then knight takes c5 to undermine the d4 knight. We end up being better in these scenarios. There are pawns to pick up. It's a very pleasant scenario. So yes, knight d7, knight d5, f5 is not particularly nice. c6, by contrast, yeah, c6 again. F5. This is very committal stuff, basically, as mentioned. So yeah, knight fd7. We're ready with knight d5 here. That's one of the big points of this rook going to d1, from c1 to d1. This is subtle stuff. This is really, really subtle stuff. It has to be said. Okay, so anyway, we have here rook fd8 being played. So you might ask, yeah, so rook fd8 is being played, not knight d7. f3, king g7, and now king f2. Other moves like rook d2, they're not really doing much. h5, h4 keeps things even, as an example. So king f2, we have h5. If knight h5 here, again, it's not that dangerous for white. Knight d5, c6, knight c3. And the thing is, this has weakened black a little bit on the d file, and here we could take on d6, king e3. This is a position we do have a small edge for white, even though black seems to have nice active pieces. Overall, it is slightly better for white. So anyway, h5, we have knight e2, knight c6, knight c3. If rook takes d6, this black can just play c takes to undouble the pawns, and this is just even. f5, we can play knight g3 to provoke this pawn forward here, and we're going to be just even. So knight c3, we have knight d4, knight e2, and now just a repetition of moves here. Knight d4, draw, agreed. If black plays rook takes d1 instead, white needs to be careful to play. What do you think white needs to play here? Yeah, knight takes d1 is the careful move here. Not rook takes d1, that would be a blunder, relatively speaking. Rook takes, knight takes a5, black has the advantage. But on knight takes d1, h4 is even. If knight takes a5 here to try and play a tactic, yeah, it backfires because the rook takes on c5 and then hitting c7 and e5. So this situation is a big advantage for white. If knight b4 is tried here, king e2, h4, c3, evicts that knight with the king now protecting d3. So knight goes back, knight e3 is a small edge for white. So okay, so the draw was agreed here. If the game continued with h4, let's say knight e8 with f5 as an intention. Let's say this position. This would be a good move, knight e8. If knight d7, it actually leads, fascinatingly, well, it depends what your definition of fascinating is. It leads to a situation which does seem troublesome for white. Yeah, this knight d5 is troublesome here. Because knight f6, then we can actually play rook a to b1. And let's take this scenario. Black's under strain here on c5 and e5. Let's say knight d7, rook d2. And we're preparing b4 potentially. Let's say c6, knight c3, this position. Rook b d1. f4. We get a situation where we have potential pawn breaks lurking like g3 at some point. We have a pressure point c5, which could be useful for slow, torturous pressure. This is just one example where we eventually play for b4 in this example, and we do have an advantage. So yes, it does seem knight d7 could potentially lead to trouble, but knight e8 was played, and now this sort of was not played. Knight e8, this is behind the scenes of the draw. If knight e8 is played, this is fine. So knight a4 as one example. Knight f6 is possible, because yeah, knight takes, there's actually knight takes c5. Guess what black has here? There's a cunning tactic. Knight takes c2, which looks at rook takes d1. If we play rook takes, then c takes, this position is just even. And if we went with knight d5 here, f5 seems to be the key for equality for black. If e takes, g takes, rook a to b1, knight e6. It's very different from before. Rook d2 check, rook takes d1. This is just an even position. So okay, this is if the game had continued, but the draw was agreed here. So if the game had continued with h4, it does seem as though knight e8 would be a key move. You can see that it supports c7 against knight d5 and prepares potentially f5 as an intention. So anyway, on the surface of this game, it looks like, you know, one of those World Championship kind of relatively dull draws. But as we see, there's excitement to be found behind the scenes of this game, especially in the opening. That opening, if it had included this opening preparation, this a5 looks on the surface a bit controversial, but we get these amazing resources behind the scenes here if bishop b4 had been played as mentioned. So yes, that was a key point of interest that I found anyway here in this position, if bishop b4 at move 10. But anyway, aside from that, yeah, later on it looks as though, you know, c5 was a vulnerable pawn, and there were like some ways to access it via a4, knight a4, or knight e1 to d3. And yeah, so this was holding black's position back from any big ambitions. Okay, so yeah, final position. Let's go to that final position again, where the draw was agreed with this repetition. Here, knight d4, this repetition. So at move 23, draw agreed. So not as exciting as game 1. So Ding Liren still, he's leading the match. You could say it's a success to draw with the black pieces in general. So a bit of success for Gukesh today, drawing the black pieces pretty comfortably and avoiding some dangerous opening trap, you know, potential big preparation there on bishop b4 stuff. Okay, comments, questions, likes, shares appreciated. If you want to check out my course on the Italian game, I have loads of courses now. Just go to Kingscrusher TV. In fact, if you just put Kingscrusher TV, you'll see courses at discounts, including the Italian game, which was used in this game. So that's all the rage at the Super Grandmaster level nowadays, the Italian game. Okay, and yeah, if you get to this point in the video, yeah, say, you know, how exciting the game was. Maybe leave a comment how exciting this game was. Okay, or just hi. This is the word hi, hi. That'd be great. Feed the YouTube algorithm for me. Okay, thanks very much.